Hi, everyone. I'm going to get us started. It's my profound honor today to welcome this year's Joseph R. Stiglitz Lecture on Equality and the Good Society. And I want to thank our McKenna Center Director, Ray Offenheiser, for organizing this event and working on it all year. I'm going to talk about our speaker in a minute. I'll say a little bit about the award. The lecture series was established here at the Keough School of Global Affairs to honor the legacy of Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate and a tireless advocate for an economy that serves the inherent dignity of every human person. The award was created specifically to recognize those rare scholars and policymakers who don't just study inequality from a distance, but who actively contribute to a good society through rigorous research and transformative policy work, both at home and across the globe. This year, we're privileged to honor someone whose career embodies that exact mission, Dr. Nora Lustig. Today's lecture will address the growing debate over whether GDP, gross domestic product, remains an adequate measure of societal progress in a world marked by climate change, increasing wealth concentration, technological disruption, and declining trust in institutions. Drawing on the work of the United Nations high-level expert group on Beyond GDP, she will also discuss the rationale complementing GDP with measures of current well-being, equity and inclusion, and environmental sustainability. Dr. Nora Lustig is a professor in the Office of the Presidency of Colegio de Mexico and Professor Emerita and founding director of the Commitment to Equity Institute at Tulane University. She's also a non-resident scholar at the Brookings Institution, the Center for Global Development, the Georgetown University Americas Institute, the Inter-American Dialogue, the Paris School of Economics, and the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. This is her retirement phase, so this is a very impressive level of activity. Her research focuses on economic development, inequality, and social policies with emphasis on Latin America. She's published more than 90 articles and 15 edited volumes and is the co-chair of the high-level expert group on Beyond GDP. Her work reminds us that inequality is not an inevitable outcome, but a policy choice. Please join me in welcoming our 2026 Joseph R. Stiglitz Lecture Awardee, Dr. Nora Lustig. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I should start by saying that all the non-resident appointments are unpaid. So, Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm very thankful to Dean Gallagher and to Ray Offenheiser for the invitation. I've had a fantastic day so far, talking with faculty and students and learning more about what the Keough School is about. I was here way back when the Keough School didn't exist yet. The Kellogg Institute was a place where I came often. I was a member of the advisory board, and I also, I think, gave a keynote at some point, probably on inequality. And so it's really a great pleasure to be here today. And I think this is the beginning of many collaborations with our colleagues here. I discovered we have a lot in common, and we can do a lot of things together to pursue the research questions. Some of them you will see I present today in the lecture. There's going to be a lot of work still to be done on this field. And also in terms of generating the data that's required to do this research, I think universities play a crucial role in terms of producing public goods of knowledge and information. So I hope that that continues to be the case here. So, by the way, my voice is low. I hope people in the back hear me. If not, join me here because there are other seats. I'll do my best in projecting. Okay, so is GDP still adequate to measure progress? I'm going to give you some introduction and motivation. The talk will discuss what the group, this Beyond GDP high-level expert group, has been working on and what the proposals are. And then what I consider to be the unfinished agenda in terms of the next stage of what needs to be researched. And I think some of you will find, given the conversations we had today, that what you're doing speaks to what needs to be still done in the research agenda. This group was established very recently. I mean, I think we're the first group that need to produce something in even less than a year of this complexity. There have been many initiatives. Usually they work 5 years or so. And so we were asked to do something in months. So we had to base our work on what's already been produced. It was established by the Secretary General himself. And the mandate that we were given is to develop a limited number of indicators that could be universally applicable, that do reflect the multidimensional nature of development, and that they are aligned with the Pact for the Future. And many of you will ask, what's the Pact for the Future? It's a report that the General Assembly put together at the UN, and where the member states, in this part that's highlighted in red, the member states asked the UN to actually start an initiative that will develop this limited set of indicators. When I was first approached, I said, but you have the SDGs, where you have almost an unlimited set of indicators because there are 213. Why are you starting something in parallel to the SDGs? Why do we need this? Also, you have the Human Development Index that's already been established. And what we were told is that, but now, they want something more limited. The SDGs became unwieldy. Governments have a hard time producing 200 and so indicators, and they wanted something that would be more parsimonious. And also, the SDGs are supposed to be coming to an end in 2030. So what comes next? So it was a good starting point now to think about what could come after the SDGs. So the characteristics of our group is we're independent, with a secretariat that's UN-based. We're 14 experts. And our work, we have been trying to build on existing frameworks while at the same time introducing new thinking. So this is a group. You may recognize there Professor Stiglitz is a member of our high-level expert group. It's, as you can see, quite interesting in terms of diversity. And it's made it also interesting from the point of view of working together, because we come from different backgrounds. Some of us from academia, others from the policy world. Some are very much coming from the statistical production work, not statistical theory. And others, like me, are economists. And we tend to have different views about what needs to be done, but we came up with something in which we converge, and I hope everybody feels that they're reflected there. So what's the problem? I mean, at the outset, the issue with GDP is something that a lot of people already know, and probably in this room, no need to abound too much, but it is a measure of economic activity, not of well-being. So what does it ignore? It ignores inequality and poverty. It does not capture environmental degradation, misses non-monetary dimensions of well-being, like health, education, peace, etc. It's then blind to violence and repression. It counts harmful activities like the destruction of forests, etc., as part of positive outputs, and it excludes unpaid work. Importantly, also for particularly the group of people like me who are interested in the quantitative analysis as well, even if they're correlated with GDP, other outcomes, which they are often, the information that you can gain by looking at them is very important. And I'll give you a few examples here with graphs that come from a paper by Jones and Klenow, two well-known macroeconomists. It was published in the American Economic Review, where they come up with a measure of Beyond GDP that's aggregated. But they start by showing how on the horizontal axis, you have GDP per person. On the vertical axis, you have life expectancy. And if you look at the group of developed countries, you can see already a difference in which the US has, more GDP, but life expectancy is shorter than it is in France and Italy and the UK. These differences become more striking when we look at annual hours of work per person. 1 minus hours work per person is the amount of leisure, right? 100. So then in the US, you produce more, but you seem to work much, much more than what happens in UK, France, and Italy, etc. These are countries that are similar in GDP per capita, but it takes much more effort. Then what's the point? I mean, of course, you produce more, but you work more. And then, so if you look at things like inequality, here compare South Africa, Brazil, with Mexico, and with which are more or less on the same GDP per capita. They're all fairly unequal, but there's still a striking difference in inequality, which means also that the share of income that the poorest receive for similar income levels is going to be lower the more unequal the country is. So there's a lot of difference, and in their paper, then they produce an aggregate indicator that I'm not going to go into. You can invite, I'm sure, Keough or Jones to come and present their work, where they show that even though their aggregate indicator, which includes consumption per capita, inequality, life expectancy, and leisure, it's highly correlated between GDP and this indicator of Beyond GDP that they have produced. But then they show that if you take the US as a numeraire, you call it 1, let's say, and you look at how the other countries rank, the information is quite telling. So all the European countries, of course, are above the US in the aggregate measure, as well as you would expect from what I showed you now. So correlation is a bad way to say, I don't care about the other information, because you miss a lot of information if you think that correlation is the only thing that matters. Okay, so GDP is a dominant metric, like there's also the sense for political scientists and sociologists in general to see this disconnect between the fact that you have economic growth and people are unhappy. There's dissatisfaction, there's protests, etc. And there's also multiple crises that even if maybe in the trend GDP is going up, there are shocks that are very traumatic, like the Great Recession, like the pandemic, and now maybe we're going through one with the energy crisis that we're facing in terms of the prices. And the fact that it's very important to think about progress in terms of not only including averages, but how the progress is distributed, what happens to non-income dimensions, and what happens to the possibility of sustaining whatever levels you have achieved in the current setting into the future. So the core idea, and this is very important, we're proposing to complement GDP, not to replace GDP. We haven't bought into the idea that GDP should not be used. I think GDP, with all its changes that it has undertaken over the years through the statistical work of the UN Statistical Commission, should continue to be used and improved, per se, as a measure of economic activity, but it has to be complemented. In the same sense, in the debate between those who think that maybe what's happened is we've grown too much and we have to start thinking about the so-called degrowth movement, we do not place our group in that context. We think that growth, economic growth, is a necessary condition for progress, not a sufficient one, but we want growth to continue. We want to sort of integrate the other dimensions beyond the economic one, and we say we want to make the invisible aspects visible. For example, what does unpaid work and the difference that exists between genders in terms of unpaid work that's not captured in GDP, and it's an important measure of well-being, and include future well-being. Concretely, the way I like this way of summarizing what beyond GDP means, it means going beyond income. So you look at dimensions that are not only non-market, even if you can think of putting a price, it's very hard to do that. This will happen with the future. It will also happen with some of the current dimensions. So it includes, like I said, health, education, security, peace, and subjective well-being. You will see in a moment our classification. We want to go beyond averages. We want to go beyond the present. And we also want to think about going beyond national borders, given the spillover effects that exist for what some countries do and their impact on the rest of the world. Starting from things as macroeconomic policy in the US affects what happens throughout the world because of its role as the currency as a global currency. But what happens in terms of wars, what happens in terms of environmental pollution. There are so many cross-national issues that none of our measures capture well. On the good and the bad side, there are some good things happening also that we need to find, and that's one of the pending tasks, by the way. We haven't been able to find an indicator that we could use to capture that, but I think it's essential to think about that. So what is new of this initiative? And you'll see in a moment why this question is important. But there's a global signal, and it came bottom up, apparently from the governments and member states, asking the Secretary General to think about this. This is the first time that it happened. All the other initiatives, including the MDGs and the SDGs, were not bottom up, or not from the member states. We propose, we call it an ambitious conceptual framework. It's a conceptual framework that tries to sort of place different layers in terms of importance, and I'll show you in a moment a graph. And then we started thinking about, so how we go from ideas to measurement. We did, in the process of constructing our measures, we did a lot of consultations with different stakeholders, including consultations online. And one of the things that we heard back, particularly from member states, is please do not do away completely with the SDGs. We have invested so much into producing the Sustainable Development Goals indicators that they should be part of your menu of indicators that will be proposed. And I'll show you in a moment they are. I said we are proposing to complement GDP, and we think of our proposals as complementary. This is very important. The initiatives undertaken by the System of National Accounts. There are initiatives also that are suggesting different ways of measuring GDP, but we decided that it is not fair to come up with something like that when you have the Statistical Commission working for years and years in changing the way GDP is measured and trying to respond to the criticisms. And we would have had an immediate, reaction of this group being alienated, and this group has to be our ally in whatever we propose. So we said, okay, you continue working with this. There is a new system that was published in 2025 that tries to incorporate environmental issues much more straightforwardly in the measurement of GDP and the satellite measures, the System of National Accounts that practically all countries implement. And these extensions, they're hoping, will be introduced by 2030. However, some countries will find it more difficult, but that is a process that's ongoing. And we just said, let's continue that process as it is, and we will produce something that's complementary. We also want to build on the existing ones, like the SDGs. There's also national and regional initiatives, especially OECD has been, and the European Union and some specific countries have implemented ways in which you can complement GDP with measures that address the things that GDP doesn't. And interesting also, the Human Development Report Office is exploring new ways of changing the measure of the HDI that may be more grounded in theory than the current version. So there may be eventually a convergence. We hope that this is something that may happen as a process. So this, when I told you that building on existing initiatives is important, this is a figure. I'm not, don't try to read it. It's going to be in the deck of slides. You're going to look at it. It's figure 1 in the book by Marc Fleurbe and Didier Chancel called Beyond GDP. This was published in 2013. So it's a mapping of all the initiatives up to 2013. If we extended this, there will be many more new initiatives, and we probably will have to extend it. And they're categorized in the different approaches that people have been pursuing, like subjective approaches, the composite or hybrid, the dashboards, which is the MDGs and the SDGs, and then what's called the accounting and monetary approaches, which are usually more if you want, related to economic theory, social choice theory, in which they try to develop indices that are consistent with the maximization of a social welfare function that describes not only monetary but also non-income dimensions. So this is an interesting demonstration that we don't have the alternative, not for lack of trying. On the contrary, there's too many initiatives, and none has become dominant. Maybe, the SDGs now become sort of part of the HDI, but not even the HDI has not replaced or become a complement because it has limitations. I'm going to mention some of them in a moment. So I think at this point, we need to have a sort of a thorough conversation among everybody that's working in this area and see if we can find some common ground and come up with something that everybody will be supporting if we wanted politically to become the complement of GDP accepted globally. Otherwise, everybody's saying, my approach is better than yours, so I want to just continue doing mine. And that's what's been happening in the realm of research as well, not just institutions. So what is it that we propose? At this point, what we propose is the conceptual framework. It starts from these principles that well-being is multidimensional. It's very important to think about people and the planet together, because now more and more people are aware that if the planet is not protected, we will not have people at some point. So you want to think about both. They consider the present and the future. And think about equity and inclusion in a cross-cutting that affects many of the dimensions that we are including. So in a nutshell, the framework is like this. And do I have a pointer, laser pointer here? Nope, whoops. I'm going wrong? Yeah. I wanted to go back. No, I was going fine. Way too much. Okay, so what do I do now? Sorry about that. I'm not familiar with the, and I don't know where. Okay.
And we'll go to, we were on this slide here. There, and then there. Okay, and now,
Yeah.
And now that's advancing it, and then.
Right, so this is the one I wanted to use the clicker, but I mean, is it okay if I move this way? Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that we started thinking is that maybe it would be desirable to think about well-being going beyond the usual things that we think about, which are material, health, education, and take into consideration what we consider primordial foundational principles that should be non-negotiable in terms of production of well-being. So we somehow saw that the UN had it right when it produced its initial charter, that peace and security are fundamentally, it's very difficult to have well-being if you live in a situation of conflict or intense insecurity. respect for human rights, and being in a livable planet. So if I could, and I know I can't because in the UN this wouldn't be acceptable, I would like to classify countries first by primordial principles and say which ones are actually producing ill-being instead of producing well-being, and then think about how they perform in other dimensions. And I always give the example, which is uncontroversial, I hope, of Chile under Pinochet, the dictatorship. It was an economic miracle. It was growing very fast. It was even improving social indicators in health and education for the poor as well. But it was a highly repressive government where unions were not legal, and people were put in jail, were tortured, were exterminated. So then it would be an ill-being first producer, and then I would look at what happens in terms of the other performance. In the UN, this wouldn't fly because no country wants to ever be classified in the first box. But I think we need to start thinking about how, outside of the governments who don't want to be classified, can we think of a framework that would help us define when, in a hierarchy, when countries are first considered to be producing well-being or not. Then, we identified 8 domains: material and work, health, education, security, subjective well-being, social cohesion, institutions, and environmental quality. And these tend to have pretty much, if you look at all the initiatives, recent ones that are looking at this, they tend to have this kind of taxonomy, maybe 1 or 2 differences, but there seems to be pretty much consensus that in order to define present well-being, those are the things you want to look at. Then, to think about tomorrow is what happens with all the capitals that will allow you to make your current well-being sustainable or not. And then equity and inclusion runs across because you have issues of poverty in all the dimensions, and you have issues of inequality in all the dimensions. So we want to consider both, in not only vertical, but also horizontal, across genders, across ethnic groups. We want to incorporate the vision of inequality, meaning equity and inclusion, throughout. So this is the way in which we try to organize the indicators. And we ended up with a dashboard of approximately 30. I say approximately, we're still fine-tuning. By the way, the report at this point is scheduled to be presented to the General Assembly on May 7. This may change, but stay tuned. It's going to be early May when it comes out. And roughly 50% were based on SDGs. As I said, this was also a petition from the consultations we've been. We paid attention to relevance, comparability, feasibility, and also whether they can be amenable to be affected by policy. All our indicators are outcome indicators. We don't have enablers, what I call enablers, which are things that if they happen, then maybe they will allow you to have better indicators in the outcome space. I think, and we concluded, that requires a different type of exercise because you have to start establishing causal links between actions and what happens to the outcome. So all our indicators are outcome indicators, and the dashboard structure has the foundational principles, the current well-being, equity and inclusion, and sustainability and resilience. Just to give you an example, for foundational principles, we said, okay, by the way, we consulted lots of experts, and I wouldn't be surprised that some of you here will say this is not the best indicator. And I think that this has to be treated as the beginning of a process, not just say this is it. We may still have to improve. The way we selected the indicators, we did all kinds of different types of analysis, to what extent some things become redundant. There's different techniques, and consulting with the experts and some people that work on peace and security. They think the number of total conflict-related death is a very telling indicator. People who work on human rights, they told us that the extent that people experience discrimination or violence against women are good indicators that capture whether you are subject to human rights violations or not. And then the total greenhouse emissions and biodiversity intactness index, which, by the way, was being produced by, I forget what institution in England. It only exists until 2014. So we have also classified our indicators by what exists today, what needs some effort, and what has to be developed in order to be able to have them in the future. This, it's going to be impossible for you to read, but again, I leave it with you. It's all the indicators that we have identified so far. There may be a few changes when we produce a final report. And, for equity and inclusion, since this is the theme that seems to be of great interest in the Keough School, we propose to use several ones. One, wealth inequality. We said, okay, what's the share, if we can, the share of wealth that goes to the top 1%? That would be a good indicator. Not easy to get for all countries, by the way. So we may have to settle for the top 5% if you want to have something that's statistically powerful. Income inequality, we're proposing the Gini index. For poverty, we propose a headcount ratio, but measured with the society poverty lines, which is something proposed by the World Bank, in which they combine absolute lines with relative aspects depending on the level of development. So every country, depending on the level of development, will have its own poverty line. And then we want to also capture things that have to do with horizontal inequalities. So we decided to use women's hourly earnings as a percentage of men's as one indicator to capture horizontal inequality, and regional inequalities, the extent to which rural population has access to all-season roads, within a certain distance. So these are, we hope, parsimonious indicators that can capture a phenomenon in its complexity. But you never are completely sure whether they're the best indicators, because these things may change over time. But after many iterations amongst ourselves and consultations with experts, consultations with the broader public, those are the indicators we came up with. So what about the next steps? And here's where I think that the research agenda becomes interesting. I think that, like I said at the beginning, it's very important to find ways to measure cross-country spillover effects. The only initiative that I know about is the one by the Center for Global Development that has the Commitment to Development Index that measures the extent to which countries do good or bad in the trade, financial, health, technology, and I forget, they have 7 or 8 domains. And they have information for about 40 countries. Now, I don't know whether that's the best indicator or and to what extent one can generalize it to the close to 200 countries that are in the world, but that's one area to explore. And if that doesn't work, then what would be a good way to capture spillovers? Then environmental sustainability, which is an area that I knew pretty much nothing about. I discovered that there are very different schools in terms of how to measure sustainability. I'm going to become unsustainable myself because this is moving. So if I move too much, please stop me. So there's the School of the Planetary Boundaries, which are primarily scientists, and the Stockholm Resilience Center with Brockstrom as the leader there. They purport that there are certain things that once you cross a threshold in terms of depletion or damage or deterioration, it's irreversible. And there's no, if you want, sustainability, that if you have more of this asset in the environment, you can compensate for having less here. The thresholds are really hard constraints. So that's one approach. The other one is the wealth accounting, which gives prices. But surprisingly, there are 2 different ones by multilateral institutions that use two very different methodologies. UNEP, which is the UN environmental agency, uses shadow prices, and the World Bank uses market prices. Of course, they give tremendously different results in terms of what is sustainable or not. Then the EU has decided, look, let's not try to aggregate using prices. Let's track what happens to the assets on their own over time. But of course, depletion or reduction or let me put it this way. The reduction in certain environmental assets, even if you measure them by themselves, not necessarily give you information whether something today is going to be sustainable tomorrow. Things can be depleted very quickly, and that may not have an effect on sustainability. Things may be depleting very slowly, but may be very crucial for sustainability. So you have to translate whatever happens in the realm of depletion to what it means for the ability to sustain current well-being. Marc Fleurbe, who is, like I said, the author of this Beyond GDP book, for environmental, he says the theory, of course, would tell you to use wealth accounting with shadow prices. But economists here know estimating shadow prices, good luck, right? So he thinks that at this point, the best is to settle for scenarios and try to sort of understand what may happen under different types of assumptions without trying to give the impression that you're doing something technically sound, but it's based on an empirical estimation that is very, very questionable. So I'm sure people here are working on sustainability. There's an entire agenda. I mean, I suggest that we need, first of all, to have a conversation. By the way, the wealth accounting group has tried to converge, and they have not been able to. UNEP and World Bank have not been able to come up with one approach. So I think that there's a lot to be done on the research side and also on the sort of conversational side among the different groups. They're all very established scientists behind this and social scientists to see what needs to be done. Finally, the other thing that I think we have in front of us is the aggregate indicators. Dashboards are a transparent way of seeing how things are moving, and but they can't tell you whether you have overall progress or not. Because in a dashboard, some things may go up, some things may go down, or they may change at different speeds. And so how do you know whether this country today is doing better than yesterday if not everything moves to the better at the same rate, or one country is doing better than another for the same reason? You don't. For that, you will need to have a way to aggregate. So the headline indicators, aggregate headline indicators, would have the ability to complement dashboards. You cannot do away with the dashboard because you want to know what the components are. But to try to summarize all the dimensions into one, make the trade-offs among dimensions explicit, which is related to what we had during the breakfast this morning, and improve communication, because if you have 230, even if you have 30 indicators to say something is better or worse, it's going to be very hard. So the key issue in aggregate indicators is how do you weigh the multiple dimensions? That is a question. And there are two broad approaches. Here I follow the survey by Kunde Kank and Mariana Lugo that I think is very useful to look at the different methodological approaches to do this. And they distinguish between the data-driven and the normative. So the data-driven are the composite indexes that are based on that let the data speak for themselves too. So they use principal components or frequency weights, factor analysis, and then they generate a composite of a certain phenomenon. That, I think, is a good approach for data reduction objectives, but not for normative evaluation of welfare, because that captures what happens to the data now. It doesn't express any of the preferences of society. So You can use them, but use them for data reduction purposes. I think we have to move into the normative well-being. And there you have three main approaches: the equal weights, which are weights given exogenously; those that think that weights can be chosen by deliberation, either through town halls or through with the experts, like the Peace Institute has an index that is created by consulting the members of that, or the preference-based weights, which you try to elicit preferences of individuals through an empirical process, which is very challenging. So the problem with the HDI, which is the one that uses exogenous equal weights, is that even though it seems that it's transparent and easy to communicate, the weights are giving an arbitrary trade-off. Essentially, you're saying, I am going to exchange this amount of health by this amount of income or by this amount of education, which has nothing to do with what maybe people's preferences are. And the HDI also has the additional issue that the way it normalizes the variables also affect the trade-offs. So equal weights with a normalization leads to strange results. And, people who are critical, they call them the critical people, like Martin Ravalion, may he rest in peace, used to call them mashup indices. He was, provocative, as those of you who met him. And he said, well, for example, the HDI, if I calculate the trade-off of health and income for Zimbabwe, it tells me that 1 year of additional life expectancy for Zimbabwe is equivalent to 52 cents of, a yearly 52 cents of PPP dollars, no? Which is ridiculous because, it's very, 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 very small, meaning that people would not be willing to give up 53 cents for an additional year of life. That sounds unusual, because that's what it says, a trade-off. And that's why they're so important, the things about weights. Then you have this expert and deliberative. The problem is deliberation by whom? In the end, because this is more maybe linked to the capability approach in some cases, although it's not clear how the Senyan capability approach in an orthodox framework would be applied. That's still a question mark, but some people think that this is a way to go. But again, you will be maybe question about who are you asking to decide what the weights are. Then the preference-based weights, they're based on individual valuations. And sometimes, some people want to use stated or revealed preferences. One approach that has been being pursued is using the life satisfaction regressions. The happiness literature has this life satisfaction index. And then particularly if you use the Gallup data, you can generate through a regression how much of health and education and other variables contribute to this life satisfaction. And people suggest maybe you can use the coefficients, the estimated coefficients, as the weights for this. However, that has problems too. The reason why I like this approach is because I like the fact that it's disciplined by a model of preferences. So if you deal with the empirical side of eliciting preferences, for me that would be the preferred approach. Not sure whether we'll be able to do it for some things beyond certain aspects. Like for life expectancy, you have a lot of empirical work that has been able to generate weights for that. But for other variables, there's no literature, and we would need to explore to see whether it gives results that make sense. But we, as part of this work, this is not the H-leg, this is already my research agenda now. We have joined with a group of researchers, Marc Fleurbet, which I mentioned, Benoit Deserves, who's a Belgian that works on measurement, and Carol Graham, some of you may know of her work on happiness. She's done a lot of that. And we're trying to generate an application, we call it a BGDP index, in which I try to anchor the weights in individual preferences and maintain the relationship with the social preference function. And essentially, I think I have, I'm not going to put any equations here, but what essentially you do, you start with GDP per capita. If you want to convert it into household disposable income, then you use a pass-through. But by the way, not all countries produce national accounts for household disposable income, which is crazy. So that the only variable that you have across countries for the 200 countries in the world pretty much is GDP. But you can change that. That's if you have the pass-through. Then when you do the inequality adjustment proposed by Atkinson in 1970. But when I started working with them, they are the mathematicians, if you want to think about measures and how to link them to. So I said, I think it would be important to have a poverty adjustment as well, because you can have countries with high inequality and low poverty, countries with low inequality and high poverty, and so we should be able to look at poverty. And they said, yeah, okay. So the word we have poverty adjustment. And we also then adjust by adjusting, meaning, if you use the median as your benchmark, the adjustments mean that countries that do better than the median, so inequality is lower than the median, poverty is lower than the median, if you're on the achievement, health is better than the median, they will have an upward adjustment to GDP. And countries that do below the median going to have a lower one. But you can use a benchmark also, the lowest level or the highest level. This is just how you want to present the information. But I think that adjusting upward and downward is easy and nice to communicate. And then, adjusting for the non-income dimensions like health, education, hopefully eventually security, subjective well-being like mental health, things like the quality of institutions and environmental quality. Eventually, we would like to adjust for all the non-income dimensions that we have identified for the average gap, but also for the deprivation. So there's poverty in all these dimensions as well, right? And it would be interesting to look both at the average and the deprivation that goes for each one of them. And let me give you a couple of, these are very preliminary, but just to whet your appetite for this, I thought it would be nice to share. The index that we're proposing is decomposable in the changes. So you can isolate the contribution of every one of the dimensions that you are including in your index. And so here, for example, the red says to what extent change in GDP. This is the change in the change in the index between 1990 and 2023, right? And so the red tells you how much actual economic growth contributed to that change in the index. The light blue tells you how much life expectancy contributed to that index. And the dark blue is how much the reduction in premature death, which is the poverty line for life expectancy, contributed. So for China, you have a situation in which growth in GDP was the dominant factor. Inequality is in the negative, so the change in the Gini was contributing in the negative sense. Poverty was also important. Changing life expectancy and changing premature death was not important. For Ethiopia, growth in GDP was important, but also a lot had to do with the improvement in life expectancy. So this is already tells you interesting stories. And then, we were doing this for the COVID effect. And in the COVID, also you start seeing interesting stories because, of course, the light blue, which is life expectancy, did badly in practically all countries except Japan. There's nothing, I don't know what Japan did, but Japan didn't have a problem with on the health side. But you'll see different things happening also in terms of GDP. Some countries were able to grow, maybe because of the stimulus. Like the US was able to grow, India was able to grow, but others experienced a reduction also in economic activity. In any event, so this type of framework would allow you to disentangle how the averages, changes in averages affected your well-being indicator, and also how the changes in deprivation. And you can do it for countries over time or comparing countries with each other at a particular point in time. So to finalize, the key messages are GDP is necessary, so we're not producing here something that would say let's destroy GDP, as some people told us when we started, but it's not sufficient. The progress is multidimensional, distribution matters, the future matters, and global interdependence matters. We like to have this idea of grounded in foundational principles that are non-negotiable, and hopefully we can come up with a framework that will allow us to do that. And for HLEC, we have produced a parsimonious comprehensive dashboard. That's what we've done. And the next steps, like I said, is cross-country spillovers, environmental sustainability, and aggregate multidimensional well-being indicator for current well-being to assess progress over time and across countries. And the next steps imply a research agenda. Well, thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Nora a few questions, just maybe one or two, maybe two, that's it, and then open it up because I think we'll probably have lots of people who want to ask questions. So first question, we have a lot of students. What drew you? So how did you get in your career to studying inequality and to this project, which is really impressive, and I think for a UN project, very efficient if you did it in a year.
Yeah, actually it was more like 10 months.
I feel better about the UN after this presentation.
Yeah, I also, think that we have underestimated certain things about the UN, if I may start with that.
Yes.
Because I realized that one of the huge roles of the UN has been as a norm-setting institution.
Yeah.
From, the sublime, like human rights. I mean, slavery was declared a violation of human rights in the late 20s. It was not before. So that the contribution of the UN to norm setting and to the pedestrian on how to measure things, I think it's a very important public good that has been underestimated in terms of what the UN does. And in fact, the US has been moving away from many of the agencies,
Yes.
but not the agencies that are in charge of measurement, by the way. Particularly the setting the more of the pedestrian, if you want, norms. Well, I think, I started getting interested in development because I was born and raised in Argentina. Then, my family migrated to the US. And from the very beginning, I was puzzled by the differences. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to understand what led to differences across countries and differences in a country. In the US, I also had a very interesting experience because when I first came, I went to junior college because we were waiting until my dad had the permanent residence of a year mm-hmm. in order to pay in-state tuition. Mm-hmm. The out-of-state tuition was 6 times more expensive. Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, I'm going to go to. And it was primarily an African-American institution. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting because then I saw a lot of the inequality that was happening in the US. Mm-hmm. So I think that it was a visual, if you want, and a mm-hmm. personal experience that led me to work on inequality. At times when lots of people didn't work on inequality. Then my mentor and teacher for a long time was Albert Fishlow, who had worked mm-hmm. a lot on inequality in Brazil. So I had an easy sort of somebody to talk to because not many people, now it's sort of like an ideal time to study inequality as an economist because there are some very, very good schools dedicated to that, mm-hmm. including Paris School of Economics.
So I have other questions. So if there's not questions in the audience, I will go back to my questions. But so I have a question just about, you're building this index. You have, how many indicators you said? You said 4?
About 30.
30, okay. What's your favorite?
No,
and why?
No, I don't have a favorite. I think that each one plays a role depending on what is it that you're trying to capture, and that's why we couldn't go to a smaller set. In fact, we really had to restrain ourselves to not go overboard. It would have been ideal to have about 10 only, but it was impossible.
Did you have an indicator that you insisted on keeping even though other people wanted to take it out?
Let's see. Not in my case, no. No, I didn't have that. I would have liked if whether we could have done a little more in terms of an aggregate indicator, but we didn't have enough time to sort of converge on something that everybody felt methodologically identified with. So that's why we're proposing this to be a next stage of the work, and it appears in the report as recommending some next stages of how to continue, whether the UN will do it or we will do it in academia. I mean, we in academia will do it,
Okay.
for sure. But whether the UN will do it or not, it's not in our hands.
Okay, I have a follow-up if we don't have questions, but I'm gonna actually allow the audience to ask questions. Alejandra? Oh, and then in the back. Oh, no, well.
Yeah.
And then in the back.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Nora. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I grew up, understanding you as one of the best economists in Mexico, where I grew up and I was born. So I feel really privileged to have you with us. I have two short questions for you. The first one is about the role of aggregation. It seems to me that I have trouble reconciling my views with aggregation because it seems like human well-being may not be aggregatable at all. So just to give one example, if I have someone who just experienced a very bad thing in their personal life, but has a very high income, how would I aggregate that well-being intuitively? It seems to me very difficult. So I guess my question is whether we should just give up the effort to aggregate well-being at all. And the second question is about correlation. You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that for the most part, people in economics have kept with GDP because they say, well, sure, there's a lot of other measures, but they all correlate 0.9 with GDP, so let's just keep with GDP. It seems to me there's an aspect of human development that hasn't really been well captured by any of the indicators that I've seen, which is the sort of spiritual or inner well-being that may not necessarily be material. Just to give the example of discrimination and in indigenous communities in Latin America. If you go to one of those indigenous communities, you will see very quickly they are discriminated. And they have very low income, so the correlation is very positive. But importantly, they also have a very tight-knit community, and they feel very happy. Mm-hmm. So the correlation, I would say, between income and spiritual well-being is actually negative. But I haven't seen anything of this sort being implemented in the data. So just to get your thoughts on those two things. Thank you.
Okay, do you want me to answer one by one, or you want to?
Yeah, for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, the example you gave about emotional ill-being, I think that this is something that these initiatives are not trying to look at. If people experience a death in the family or things like that, those are not part of the understanding of social well-being. Very important as they are, we're not able to capture them. But even in the context of things that are part of the social barometers, there are things that may be hard to incorporate in a measurement that's aggregatable. And for example, the primordial principles, the foundational principles, may not be aggregatable. Because if you start thinking, okay, But I mean, it's really the violation of should discrimination be measured by the extent to which percentage of people feel discriminated, or there should be no discrimination? I mean, so I think that there's no. I don't have an answer for that yet. You know, I was explaining to you that even Marc Fleurbe has this group in the International Panel on Social Progress that now wants us to think about that, because I asked him, since he's the equations man and the social choice theories, I mean, how would you incorporate minimum thresholds?
Incorporate.
In the social welfare function, things that you say, if you transgress them, then you start producing ill-being. So he produced different mathematical specifications, and then he came back and said, you know what, I conclude that we need to have a separate classification for that. That is more qualitative than quantitative. And there's where we need philosophers in this quest, in which what is it that you can actually aggregate and what not. It is, in the end, a question that in some senses has a philosophical approach to be considered. But, if you don't aggregate certain things, then you never know whether you're in a better situation than not, if you don't take into account the extent to which people are willing. We all are always giving up something for something else, even if we're not doing it consciously. So even if you're very poor and you face tragic choices, like I love that expression by Martha Nussbaum, you still make that choice. No? If you need to skip a meal to go to the doctor, you made that choice. You shouldn't be put in that position, but you did make that choice, right? So I think that the aggregation needs to be brought in. Maybe in the end we decide not to. I am not fundamentalist on any of this. I think that we're at a stage in which a lot of work needs to be done by different disciplines to sort of come up with something that will be transformational and dominant. We cannot have 100 initiatives and all of them claiming that they have the real thing. So, yeah. And the second one about the correlation, the question was whether, you can have inverse correlation. I mean, that if you look at Carol Graham's book on happy peasants and miserable millionaires, I don't know if you know about that book. Yeah, she published it at Brookings in the 2000-something, where she looks at this paradox that if you use happiness indices, but happiness captures certain things. I mean, the happiness crowd, the fundamentalists say, let's only have life satisfaction and nothing else. But that seems to be a little extreme, because you don't capture many other things that you may want to capture in social well-being. But maybe you want to look at that book, because it goes precisely in the direction you mentioned.
In the back, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this. It's funny, one of the first things I'm in the Master of Global Affairs here, and one of my first assignments, I'm in the Sustainable Development concentration, was learning about GDP, and then saying if you had to propose a new indicator to holistically look at it, what would it be? So it's cool to see that this is coming to fruition. I had two very interrelated questions. The first, you primarily talked a lot about this new kind of dashboard, the HELG, and then at the end you talked a little bit about the BGDP. And so I guess a question is, are you kind of proposing that we have these two indicators, one which is more like dashboard style, one more in which you apply to GDP? And then my kind of follow-up question to that is, in proposing these perhaps two indicators, how do you ensure that this isn't just another indicator on the shelf? How do you ensure that this is used alongside GDP in really understanding countries? Thank you.
So with respect to the first, well, in the high-level expert group, we just proposed the dashboard. We are not proposing to choose one aggregate indicator. We're proposing for people to think about it. And I think that the exercise of thinking about it and see whether it provides information that is useful, like, I show this component by component how it affects overall well-being, then to sort of go for it. Now, how do you convince? I think that the process will depend on the extent to which, maybe in the UN, with this, when we present the report, maybe the General Assembly comes up with some conclusion that yes, they like the idea of having this dashboard. Maybe they say, yes, it's a good idea to continue with the aggregate indicator exploration and the sustainability indicators that still we have a lot of work to do. And that would put it in the political process. Maybe it'll end in nothing, but it's better if it happens because it's gives you hope that it may occur down the road if it's embraced by member states. We also will have to work with the multilateral organizations because representatives in the UN come more from the foreign policy area and not from the ministries of finance. And we need to have the ministries of finance on board if any of this will actually gain traction. Otherwise, they will stay in the shop. So there'll be a lot of work that has to be done on the dissemination. And I don't want to call it advocacy in the sense of saying, but in convincing people of why this may be useful. And actually, in the consultation process, we spoke with people at the IMF and with people at the World Bank already because we wanted them to know we're doing this and to reassure them that we're not recommending degrowth or eliminating GDP because that immediately shuts down a lot of the conversation. So I think it's a process, and everybody can be part of that process. You guys can be part of the process too, that one has to think about where the intervention may be more effective.
I see Andres right here. Yeah.
Thank you, Nora. That was fantastic. And one question I had, and I'd like to know what the debate was within the elite, the expert group, is the question of democracy or the question of governance more generally. Because when we talked about GDP, it was usually separate from democracy or governance, and there were long decade debates about what is where the causal arrow goes. But when you start talking about a more composite, more rich measure, the beyond GDP, and you mentioned human rights, etc., there's the obvious question about what kind of regime or what kind of state capacity would enable that. So I'm curious to know what the debate was and how the decision was made that was not going to be an explicit indicator of the dashboard, but human rights only.
Oh, you mean why democracy was not included?
Why governance more generally?
Well, governance appears in the institutional quality. So that one will have trust in institutions, for example. So we do have some governance indicators. There was no debate, actually. Everybody, in that sense, the ideological orientation of the group was pretty homogeneous because everybody agreed with the fact that we needed to get primordial, non-negotiable principles for things that had to do human rights, peace, security, and livable planet. So that was not the issue. The issue was more discussions about what kind of indicators to use down the road, how to present them, whether it makes sense to have an aggregate and which one, how to measure sustainability. In the end, we did not recommend using wealth accounting because of the reasons that I mentioned, and we went more with the measuring the different capitals individual. But I find that there's a lot of work to do. So there was no decision of saying we're not going to incorporate it. We actually say in the report that one of the reasons why you need to pursue different indicators has to do with erosion of democratic institutions, and you want to. Which one would you have included?
Some measure of state capacity, and the World Bank governance very vague about that. They measure rule of law, corruption, etc. Those have been undermined so much, the measure and the actual practice, that a form of accountability would be useful. some indicator of accountability.
But trusting government doesn't do?
It can come in different ways, depending on whether you have a more democratic or less democratic government. You can still trust or fear, but I think some level of voice or accountability would be useful to have.
Yeah, the state capacity I would have classified as an enabler of the outcomes. So we're, like I said, we're not measuring the enablers, because that would have been an entire different exercise. But I mean, it'd be good if you can look at the indicators and tell us which one we missed. Maybe, we can still consider it in the next stage.
Yeah, you have till May 7th. Other questions from the audience? Yeah, here and then next to you. And then over here. I see 1, 2, and then 3.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Min. I'm a postdoc at Keough. I also do research on developing and measuring welfare. So my question here is that, so this Beyond GDP measure is great. And my question here is, do you consider, when choosing indicators and aggregating indicators, do you consider whether this measure can be constructed at a smaller regional level, for example, because can we construct this measure at the district level or in the extreme case, like a village level, because that's sometimes a public of interest or for the researchers doing some causal inference or something. So I wonder that's a dimension that you care about.
Oh yeah, it can be constructed for any unit, geographical unit that you have data. It's that there's no limitation in that sense except the data.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, very thank you for the BGDP measure. And one question I have is, like, after you apply these new measures, have you found any findings or interesting trends that you observe after you apply these new measures, and you see, for example, a trend or a finding that has been neglected by a lot of the people?
Yeah, I should say that I showed you a preview of what we're doing. So it's we haven't completed the empirical analysis. This paper is an ongoing work. So we hope to have a working paper version in about a couple of months, in which we will have that. But one thing that I noticed is I showed you the thing about COVID. And interestingly, one thing that, and I think we would probably have to write a paper just on COVID after. So if you take 2019, 2020, and you look at Brazil was doing very well, because they expanded the safety net tremendously. So things look really, and the health hadn't been affected. If you use 2019, 21, which is what I showed you here, Brazil looked really bad. Yeah. So it can actually let you see how things evolve in terms of actual impact of certain policy decisions. That it was okay in 1 year because the safety net was expanded, but then they had to reduce it again. And the sort of lax approach to the health issue resulted in very, and a number of excess deaths. Mexico looks awful in the first group, because they didn't have any health policy that was sensible at the time. The government was encouraging people to go out instead of protecting themselves. And so Mexico had a tremendous amount of excess death. And it's the only country in the world, I think, that didn't expand safety nets.
Well, China would be interesting too. You didn't show China on that chart for COVID, but also was very successful until 2022, and then opened up without precautions, without good vaccination rates, and
but you reversed the results. So this would allow us to. I'm looking forward to see what other stories I can, and I'd like to add more variables, because right now we have life expectancy, income, inequality, income poverty, and poverty in the life expectancy dimension. But it'd be nice to see what happens if you look at education and learning, because one of the things that COVID had an impact on is probably the amount of human capital. Even if people graduated, they probably learned much less than before, no? So it was.
Anne, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lustig. It's been great to listen to you, and I especially want to just echo your call for involvement of ethicists and philosophers in these discussions. I think back to the founding of the UN and how involved they were in that, and they seem to have been sidelined often in UN discourse since then, so I really would echo that. The question I have for you is, I'm a visiting professor of the practice. I usually am based in Europe, and a lot of the work that I've done has been using data from the ILO, World Bank, sometimes trying to create or invent very simple indices, nothing as robust as what you're doing, but to influence and help particularly businesses sort of decide where it's wise or ethical to be producing in a supply chain context. And so what we were finding is that you have underreporting. So I suppose it really comes down to kind of this question of junk in, junk out, right? And so there are incentives certainly for countries that often are self-reporting, as member states. And what we're increasingly finding, particularly in this this war of epistemological warfare, right? Or like who's controlling the narrative about my country, right? And so there's so many incentives now, also just to be able to get good trade policy, right? There's a lot of incentives either to not report or to not report accurately. And so has your group talked about that? Because again, junk in, junk out, I'm not quite sure how we overcome that, particularly in the current context.
Right, and we in the recommendations emphasize investing in the production of data and the capacity building in the countries to be able to produce data and analyze data. But again, we need to have another agent in this global arena to participate in the production of information, because governments are subject to political whims, no? So there's where I see a role for universities and multilateral organizations, even more for universities, no? Because multilateral organizations are owned by the governments who are member states, and so they can impose restrictions. And I think the universities have hopefully the ability to be free in terms of producing the public good that is so essential, which is high quality information.
Right, exactly. We have time for, I think, one more question from the audience. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you, Professor. So my question is related to the slide on environmental sustainability. So one thing I missed was noticing was carbon emissions. So is there a plan to integrate carbon emissions? I'm asking because the EU is going to implement the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So it is going to be an actual policy tool which is going to impose taxes on other countries based on carbon emissions. And also because there's a historical component to carbon emissions as well, because developed countries have had their day in the sun, and now developing countries such as India, China, and African countries, they have the onus is on them to curtail their emissions. And this is a sticky point at all the conference of parties as well. So is there, how would you potentially integrate
that's
that?
a very tough issue, because of course, those who already produce all the carbon emissions that have started to produce the damages that we're experiencing are getting, in a way, free ride, because now the cost of adjustment is imposed on others.
Yeah.
And that's where the sort of approach of the spillover effects and cross-country things have to come in. They have not been able to come up with a solution in which there's a redistribution in terms of if I'm going to do less of this, then pay me, because you already made your share. One needs to think about whether maybe, the technical solution is there for, measuring how much countries owe to each other, but the political organization to actually implement these compensation schemes, I think is going to be really hard. But that will affect all the policies that have spillover effects, not just, but the environment now is one of high focus. So that's a political issue. And you guys who worked with the Ray, you worked with the organizations. I mean, how would you pursue that in order to be able to convince countries to agree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very difficult. We all consume and buy electronics like our phones and laptops. We buy them and we use them here. The environmental degradation happens in Africa for the critical minerals that are dug out and in China for the production. But those things are not measured accurately across the different borders. So, no.
Right.
I think we're out of time. I want to thank everybody. I want to also just thank Dr. Lustig for talking about this project. We talk a lot at the school about integral human development and this idea of the whole individual and thinking about development. And you're actually implementing, I think, what we've talked, like, how do you actually measure this? And it's great to see the UN also prioritizing it in many countries. So thank you so much.
An attempt. Let's see what happens.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.